On a glittering winter night in Gilded Age, New York, the chandeliers burn like captured stars, and one cruel sentence shatters an entire life. In front of 100 watching eyes, Mia Fairchild is branded the magnate's ugly daughter. Overnight, she becomes a joke in the salons of Fifth Avenue, exiled to a forgotten orchard, far from the ballroom that broke her. But in the silence of the Hudson Valley, a widowed farmhand, a sleeping child, and a dying empire will force Mia to face an impossible choice: duty to a ruined name, or the dangerous, stubborn pull of her own heart. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what do you love most about historical romances? New York City, winter of 1889. The snow outside had softened the city's roar into a hush, but inside the Fairchild mansion on Fifth Avenue, everything shimmered with the brilliance of a society that believed itself eternal. The gas chandeliers dripped crystal tears. The velvet curtains, the size of sails, swayed gently with the warmth of 100 bodies clothed in silk and expectation. Strings played something French, lilting and elegant, and the clink of champagne flutes punctuated the air like delicate glass bells. Mia Fairchild stood near the edge of the ballroom, spine erect, eyes lowered. Her gown, a deep plum silk faille trimmed in ivory lace, fit her like an apology, tasteful, modest, and crafted not to attract, but to conceal. The velvet sash at her waist was a quiet rebellion, a richer tone than her dressmaker had advised. It was her only indulgence, and even that had been chosen in silence. Her hair, thick and chestnut brown, was gathered in a low chignon, a few soft strands having escaped near her temples. She had not allowed the maid to shellac them down. They were hers, unruly, but hers. She wore her mother's gold locket, oval, plain, warm against her skin, hidden beneath her bodice. Mia could feel its weight more than usual that night. She had practiced her smile, the one that suggested serenity without expectation. At nearly 30, she had learned how to stand very still and be looked at without truly being seen. To her left, debutantes glided past, ribbons trailing behind them like echoes. To her right, dowagers peered over lorgnettes, searching for errors in posture or pedigree. Beyond the grand staircase, where guests continued to arrive, the name Fairchild rose in whispers, some reverent, some speculative. "Railroad empire," murmured one guest. "Steel holdings in Pennsylvania. Still no engagement for the daughter?" asked another, not even bothering to lower her voice. "She reads Greek," someone scoffed, as if it were a disease, "and writes poetry." Mia had learned not to flinch. Across the ballroom, Lionel Beechcroft leaned against a pillar, one hand loosely holding a flute of champagne, the other gesturing lazily as he spoke to a cluster of men with inherited jawlines and inherited boredom. He was handsome in that careless way that money allows, with golden hair swept back too perfectly to be natural. His laughter always arrived just before his cruelty. Mia felt his gaze before she saw him look her way. Her breath caught, not from hope, but from something colder. Lionel smiled, not kindly. "There she is," he said, his voice raised just enough to carry over the music. "The magnate's ugly daughter." The air left the room. A pause, a ripple, a cruel, stifled laugh from someone who didn't mean to laugh, but did. The musicians missed a beat. Mia blinked once, and then again, because it was the only motion she could trust. Her throat burned. Her spine remained straight, but the ballroom tilted around her the way a ship does before it sinks. She did not cry. She did not flee, not yet. Beechcroft turned back to his companions, already losing interest. The damage had been done. The phrase, sharp as a broken comb, was already passing from lips to ears, like gossip born in the dark, seeking air. Mia turned slowly and walked toward the corridor, one gloved hand brushing the damask wallpaper as she passed. Each step was measured, silent. She did not stumble. She found the library empty. Of course it was. No one ever sought books at a ball. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the room was dim but familiar. She allowed herself to breathe, alone, and finally unclasped the velvet ribbon of her sash. Her fingers trembled. A moment later, the door creaked. She straightened as her father entered, his expression unreadable behind his silver pince-nez. Charles Fairchild was a man of structure and consequence. Even now, with his empire strained and whispers of financial tremors trailing him like shadows, he carried himself like someone whose name had become part of the city's architecture. "I heard," he said simply. "It will pass." Mia looked up at him, eyes dry but shining with fury. "It never passes. It stays. It follows." Charles exhaled slowly, removing his gloves. "You've always taken these things too personally. This is society. You know how it feeds." "I'm not meat." "No," he replied, and for a moment his voice faltered. "You're my daughter, and that still means something." The silence between them filled the room like fog. "I want to leave," she said. He didn't ask where. He already knew. The country estate, the Hudson Valley house with its forgotten orchard and its long winters, far from the carriages and the columns and the cutting eyes. "You'll be out of the way until it fades," he agreed. "Let them gossip themselves hoarse." Mia turned away. "They already have." Charles approached, his footsteps soft on the rug. He rested a hand on her shoulder, a gesture not of affection, but of possession. "You'll stay quiet. You'll keep your dignity. And in a month, they'll have found another daughter to mock." She nodded, not because she agreed, but because it was the only way to end the conversation. He left with the same careful economy of words with which he had arrived. Later that night, Mia sat alone in her room, still in her gown, the fire burning low. She removed the locket and opened it for the first time in months. Inside, her mother's faded miniature smiled gently, eyes that had known both softness and strength. She whispered to the empty room, "I'm not who they see." Outside, the snow fell quietly onto the stone steps of Fifth Avenue, where the name Fairchild gleamed in brass letters, untouched by wind or shame. But within the woman who bore it, something had cracked, not broken but shifted, and the silence that followed was not of defeat, but of something waiting to begin. The train cut through the misty countryside like a ribbon of iron, winding past hills still caught between the last breath of winter and the shy blush of spring. Mia Fairchild sat alone in the private compartment, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blurred world beyond the window. The frost had retreated, but only just. Here and there, stubborn patches of snow clung to the roots of trees, refusing to yield. She wore a traveling cloak in midnight blue wool, buttoned to the throat, and a simple bonnet tied beneath her chin. The plum silk dress from the ball had been carefully packed away, out of sight but not out of memory. Her face was pale, her eyes darker than usual. She had spoken little since boarding the train, responding to the porter's polite inquiries with nods and gestures. Even her voice, always quiet, had retreated further into silence. It had been years since she last visited the country estate in the Hudson Valley. It had belonged to her mother's family before Charles Fairchild expanded and modernized it, tearing down old barns and fencing the wild land for commercial use. The orchards had once been glorious, she recalled, apple, pear and plum trees that danced in the wind like green oceans. But after her mother's passing, the land had been left untended, slowly curling into ruin, like something abandoned in mourning. When she stepped off the train, the air struck her with its difference. It smelled of damp soil and cold bark, with none of the coal smoke and perfume of the city. The carriage was waiting. The driver, old Walter, gave her a warm nod but said nothing. He seemed to sense she was a woman made of broken glass that day. Better not to press. The ride from the station to the estate was long, winding past bare fields and stone walls veined with moss. And then, rising out of the pale earth like something forgotten by time, the Fairchild country home appeared. pale grey stone, ivy-clad in places, with shuttered windows and a roof that sloped like a tired brow. It wasn't grand, but it was dignified. Mia did not smile, but something eased in her chest as the wheels crunched over gravel and the gate creaked open. The staff had been reduced. Only 2 maids and the cook remained, plus a hired steward to oversee maintenance. Her father had mentioned a man working the orchards, Walsh, she believed, but had said little more. She was grateful for the quiet. Too many voices were unbearable. Her room faced the back of the house, overlooking the orchard. When she first opened the window, a chill swept in, smelling of thawing earth. The trees were still bare, their limbs clawing at the sky. Many were half dead, neglected, their trunks coated in lichen and moss. They looked like widows, waiting for someone to remember them. On the second day, Charles Fairchild arrived unexpectedly. The horses were still steaming when he stepped from the carriage, his coat flapping in the wind. He stayed only long enough to review paperwork with the steward and to inquire perfunctorily about Mia's state of mind. "You'll be safe here," he said without looking at her. "Away from the gossip." She didn't reply. His face was drawn, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He coughed once, then again, hiding it behind a gloved hand. She noticed, but he waved her off. Cold air. Nothing more. He left the same afternoon. She watched the carriage disappear into the horizon, the plume of dust rising behind it like smoke. That night, for the first time in weeks, she walked alone into the orchard. The boots she wore were wrong for the mud, but she didn't care. She stepped over fallen branches and sodden leaves, making her way toward the grove of apple trees. The silence was different here. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. The wind whispered through the bare branches as though the trees remembered her. It was then she heard the sharp rhythm of metal against bark. She turned, and there, half hidden by a leaning apple tree, stood a man. He was tall, his back to her, one boot braced against the roots as he swung a hatchet in clean, efficient arcs. Each motion was purposeful, deliberate, practiced. He wore a thick linen shirt rolled to the elbows, the fabric damp at the collar, and suspenders taut across his shoulders. His dark brown hair was long enough to curl at the edges, damp with sweat, and he worked without pause, as though the world around him did not exist. Mia cleared her throat. He turned, startled, lowering the blade. Their eyes met, hers wide and cautious, his narrowed in surprise. He removed his cap. "Ma'am?" There was no bow, no smile, just acknowledgement. And in that small gesture, Mia felt more seen than she had in years. "You must be Mr. Walsh," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, miss," he replied. "Daniel Walsh. I was hired last fall. I managed the orchard." A pause stretched between them. He waited, neither deferential nor rude, simply still. Mia glanced around at the grove. "You're working alone?" "For now. When planting season comes, I'll hire boys from the nearby farms, but pruning," he gestured toward the gnarled branches, "requires patience and a sharp edge." Mia nodded, unsure what else to say. The wind picked up and she drew her cloak tighter. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't." Another pause, and then, without fanfare, he turned back to the tree and resumed his work. She watched him a moment longer, then turned back toward the house, her heart thudding, not from fear nor shame, but something quieter. A curious awareness, like a thread had been pulled inside her, and she did not yet know to what it was tied. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows stretched across the parlor walls, Mia sat alone by the fire. Her tea had gone cold. She opened the locket, her fingers trembling as she traced her mother's miniature portrait. The face inside the oval was serene, soft-eyed, painted in tones of gold and rose. "I'm trying," she whispered. From the hallway came the faint sound of a child's laughter, a light tread. Mia rose, curious, and stepped out. There, half concealed behind the staircase, was a small boy, no older than 7, holding a carved wooden horse in one hand and staring up at her with round, curious eyes. He had a mop of dark curls and cheeks flushed with colour. He didn't speak, just blinked. "You must be Thomas," Mia said gently. He nodded, then clutched the toy closer to his chest. "I'm Mia," she offered, crouching slightly, careful not to alarm him. "Do you like stories?" He hesitated. Then, with the shy confidence of a child testing the waters, he whispered, "Yes." She smiled, the first true smile in days. "Well then," she said softly, "perhaps tomorrow I'll find a book for us." He grinned, then darted away down the corridor, his small feet pattering like raindrops. Mia stood slowly, her eyes lingering on the space he had just occupied. That night she sat by her window, gazing at the orchard under a silver moon. The trees stood silent, waiting. Somewhere out there, a man with rough hands and a quiet gaze was still at work. And within these walls, a child who had known loss, like her, had smiled at the thought of stories. The air smelled of thawing earth and something else. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of it. And the first breath of something unnamed, drifting just beyond reach. The days in the countryside unfolded with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The silence of the orchard no longer seemed so empty. It had begun to hum with the rhythm of life returning. The trees, though still skeletal and bare, held the faintest shimmer of green at their tips, tiny buds pushing forward despite the cold. Nature, it seemed, was stubborn, and so was Mia Fairchild. Each morning, she awoke before the fire had fully burned out in the hearth, her body chilled, but her thoughts quiet. The city's cruel laughter had faded into memory, dulled by the hush of the hills and the companionship of solitude. And yet, as the orchard breathed and shifted outside her window, Mia found herself pulled from her stillness, drawn towards something she could not name. She watched him first, from the upstairs corridor, standing behind the lace curtains, Daniel Walsh. The man worked with a patience that was almost reverent. She would see him walking the orchard rows in a slow, steady pace, his hands gloved in leather, his head bowed slightly, not in defeat, but in thought. Sometimes he would pause before a tree, studying it the way a man studies a wounded creature. Then, with quiet care, he would prune a branch, always at the right angle, always at the right place. There was something in his steadiness that calmed her, even as it unsettled her. He was not like the men she had met in ballrooms. No sharp wit, no sharpened smiles, no practiced compliments. He did not pretend to see her as something she wasn't, nor did he seem to expect anything of her at all. He simply worked, and in doing so, reminded her that there was dignity in labor, in attention, in silence. One morning, compelled by something deeper than curiosity, Mia stepped outside with her cloak drawn tight and walked the narrow path that led into the orchard. The sun had just begun to warm the frost-hardened ground, and a low mist hovered near the roots of the trees. She found him by the far row of apple trees, his sleeves rolled up despite the chill, a small pile of fallen branches gathering at his feet. He did not hear her approach. When she cleared her throat, he turned, just a flicker of surprise in his expression, before it settled into calm recognition. "Miss Fairchild," he said, nodding once. She took another step forward. "You've done a great deal since I last walked these rows." "It's not much, just clearing what's dead to give the living a chance." His words struck something in her, so simply said, yet so rich in meaning. "I'd like to help," she said, hesitantly, "if that's permitted." He studied her for a breath, not with judgment, not with suspicion, just a quiet weighing of her intent. Then he nodded. "All right." She bent to gather a fallen branch, mindful of her footing in the damp grass. The bark flaked in her gloved hand, and a faint scent of moss clung to the wood. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the snap of twigs, the distant call of a mourning dove, and the rhythm of shared labor. Now and then their hands would brush when reaching for the same branch. Each time Mia's breath caught, and she glanced at him. but he kept his gaze on the trees as though such contact meant nothing. And yet, she sensed he felt it too. It was not indifference. It was restraint. That afternoon, her arms sore but her spirit strangely light, Mia returned to the house. As she stepped through the side entrance, she heard a faint rustling in the library. Curious, she followed the sound, and there, nestled on a velvet settee, sat Thomas Walsh. He had a book open on his lap, one far too large for his small hands. The pages were yellowed with age, the spine cracked. He looked up, startled when he noticed her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I just wanted to look." Mia smiled gently. "Books are meant to be looked at." She crossed the room slowly, easing down into a chair across from him. "Do you know how to read yet?" He shook his head. "Not much. Papa says I will soon." Mia reached out, gently taking the book from him. It was an old volume of fables, the kind with elaborate illustrations and long, winding sentences. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, his eyes wide. And so she did. Her voice, quiet at first, grew steadier as the words danced into the warm afternoon air. The tale was of a fox and a vineyard, of hunger and pride, and as she read, Thomas leaned closer, enraptured. He returned the next day, and the next. Each evening, after the orchard work had quieted and the sun began to stretch long shadows across the floor, Thomas would find his way into the library. Mia would have a different book ready, sometimes a tale of heroes and dragons, other times a story of kindness and cleverness. Daniel never entered the room, but once Mia glanced up and saw him in the doorway, watching. He said nothing, only nodded, and left. But in his eyes she glimpsed something unspoken, a kind of reverence perhaps, or something deeper. Not for her beauty, for she had long ceased trying to possess it, but for the way she had reached into his son's world and brought back laughter. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the library windows, casting dappled light across the carpet, Mia placed the book aside and rested her hands on her lap. "My mother used to read to me under the apple trees," she said, her voice soft. Thomas looked up at her, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "She had a voice like spring," Mia continued. "Soft but strong. I used to think the trees listened too." She reached for the locket around her neck and opened it. "This is her," she said, showing Thomas the tiny portrait. "Her name was Isabel. She wore lavender and always smelled like lilacs." Thomas leaned in close, studying the face within the oval. "She's pretty," he whispered. Mia smiled, a tear forming at the corner of her eye. Yes, she was. Later that evening, Mia walked once more through the orchard, the sky turning lavender and gold. She carried the locket in her hand, her thumb brushing the warm metal. She came upon Daniel as he knelt beneath a tree, inspecting the roots. He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, without prompting, Mia said, "That locket is all I have left of her." Daniel stood slowly, brushing soil from his hands. He studied her, his green eyes steady and unreadable. "I saw the way Thomas looks at you," he said. "He hasn't smiled like that in a long time." Mia swallowed, emotion tightening her throat. "I didn't plan it. I just remembered what stories can do." They stood there, the wind wrapping around them like a shawl, the orchard breathing around them. "You're not what they say," Daniel murmured. Mia's eyes flickered. "What do they say?" He hesitated. "That you're cold, distant, uninterested in the world." "And what do you think?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel met her gaze. "I think you've been waiting for someone to speak to you like you matter." Mia inhaled sharply, not because it hurt, but because perhaps for the first time it didn't. The air between them shimmered with something fragile and new. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Daniel, with his hands still stained from earth and sap, offered her a look of respect so honest it nearly undid her. The sun slipped behind the hills, and the orchard sighed in sleep. Mia stood very still, a woman on the edge of something unnamed, and let the silence hold her. The first true warmth of spring arrived not as a grand declaration, but as a whisper, soft sun filtering through thinning clouds, a delicate shimmer of green spreading across the orchard, the faintest hum of life awakening beneath the soil. Mia Fairchild stepped into the morning with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her breath curling into the cool air as she made her way toward the apple trees. Each day the land revealed something new, as though the earth itself had decided she was worth welcoming. The buds that now dotted the branches were small and shy, but they were present, and their presence affected Mia more deeply than she expected. It was as if the orchard had been waiting, suspended in quiet grief, and now found the courage to breathe again. She understood that feeling intimately. She found Daniel Walsh kneeling at the base of a young tree, his broad frame bent in concentration. His shirt sleeves were rolled past his elbows, exposing forearms browned by the sun and dusted with earth. He held a slender branch in one hand and a small knife in the other, moving with the calm precision of a man accustomed to coaxing the stubborn into bloom. When he heard her approaching, he glanced up briefly. His expression remained composed, but there was a softness in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of their growing familiarity. "Good morning, Miss Fairchild," he said as he stood, wiping the blade carefully before sliding it into his satchel. "The trees are waking. They needed the warmth." "So did I," she replied, before she could stop herself. She flushed at her own honesty, but Daniel gave no sign of judgment. He simply nodded, the morning light catching in his green eyes. She noticed the branch he held. "You're grafting." "Yes. This one is strong, but the upper limbs are failing. It needs a partner, something that can lend it new life." Mia stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing the damp grass. "May I learn?" Daniel hesitated, not out of reluctance, she sensed, but out of a quiet respect that made her pulse tremble. "If you wish," he said softly, "but it requires patience." "I have patience," she whispered, "or at least I'm learning it." He selected a branch, then guided her to the tree. His voice was low, calm, steady as a winter river. "You begin here," he said, indicating the strong limb. "Cut at an angle, clean, not rushed. The tree feels the difference." She lifted her hand, and for a moment their fingers brushed as he passed her the knife. The contact was fleeting, mere seconds, but it pulled something taut inside her chest. She positioned the blade exactly as he'd shown her. "Good," he murmured, standing close enough that she felt the quiet heat of him. "Steady. Don't force it." She exhaled slowly and made the cut. When the wood split cleanly, Daniel's approval came in a single nod, subtle but striking. They worked together for the next hour, grafting branch after branch, the silence between them warm rather than awkward. Once, when she pressed too hard and the blade slipped, Daniel reached out instinctively, his hand covering hers to steady her grip. The moment lingered, their eyes met, and Mia felt her breath catch, not in fear or embarrassment, but in a yearning so quiet it frightened her with its clarity. When she finally stepped back, brushing a stray hair from her cheek, she realized her heart was racing. She blamed the effort, though both of them knew better. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Mia returned to the orchard carrying a tray with a teapot, 2 cups, and a small plate of biscuits she had shyly asked the cook to prepare. She wasn't sure why she brought 2 cups. Perhaps she was simply being polite. Perhaps she hoped he would pause his work long enough to share a moment with her. Daniel was repairing an old fence at the far edge of the orchard. When he noticed her, he set aside his tools and approached, his steps slow and measured. "You didn't need to bring that," he said, though his voice lacked any true protest. "I know," she answered, "but I wanted to." For a heartbeat neither moved. Then Daniel carefully removed his gloves and sat on the low stone wall near the tree line. She poured the tea, her hand steadier than she expected. The first sip drew a quiet hum of approval from him, so soft she almost missed it. But she heard it, and it warmed her more than the tea itself. "Do you ever rest?" she asked. "Not as often as I should," he admitted. "That makes 2 of us," she murmured. The sun bathed them in amber light, the orchard glowing like a world caught between seasons. Mia felt suspended in that moment, as though time had curled itself gently around them. She reached for a book she had tucked beneath her arm. "May I read something?" she asked. Daniel blinked, taken aback. "To me," heat crept up her neck. "You don't have to listen." "I want to," he said. She opened the worn volume of poetry, tracing the familiar page with her fingers. "This was my mother's," she said quietly. "She used to read to me under the apple trees on warm days. When she spoke, everything felt possible." Daniel's gaze softened. "You were close to her." "Yes," her voice wavered. "She had a gentle way. She made me believe the world had room for someone like me." "There is room," he said, in a tone so firm, so certain, that her heart trembled. She read then, her voice weaving through the orchard like a ribbon of sound. It was a poem about beginnings, about the courage of seeds, about the faith of seasons. Daniel listened without blinking, his hands loosely clasped, his posture relaxed but attentive. When she finished, silence settled around them again, warm, unhurried. "Thank you," he said. "Your voice, it carries peace." Her throat tightened. "I didn't know I had any to give. You have more than you think." Just then, a small shape emerged from behind a nearby tree. Thomas Walsh, holding a wooden horse and rubbing sleep from his eyes. His curls glowed in the fading light, and Mia's heart softened instantly. "Were you looking for your father?" she asked gently. Thomas nodded, then approached her with the trust of a child who had already found safety in the sound of her voice. Without hesitation, he climbed onto the low wall beside her and leaned against her arm. Within minutes, his small head rested on her shoulder, his breathing deep and slow. Mia froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the child's trust. Then, tenderly, she brushed his curls back, smoothing them with slow, gentle strokes. The warmth of his small body seeped into her, and she felt something loosen deep inside, a knot she had carried for far too long. Daniel watched them. He stood a few steps away, his posture rigid yet fragile, as though caught between the ache of memory and the pull of something new. In Thomas's peaceful slumber against Mia's shoulder, Daniel saw echoes of another life, one filled with softer mornings and gentler evenings, long before sorrow reshaped him. For the first time in years, the grief in his chest did not hollow him. It stirred, and that terrified him. Mia did not see the storm of emotions moving through him, but she felt the shift in the air when he finally spoke. "I should take him," he said quietly. She nodded, and gently eased Thomas into his father's arms. The boy murmured, then settled against Daniel's chest. "You're good with him," Daniel said softly, almost reluctantly. "And he is easy to love," she replied. Their eyes held, the moment thick with unspoken truths, neither dared voice. That evening, as the sky deepened into violet and the first stars pierced the dusk, Mia returned to the house feeling lighter than she had since childhood. Yet her heart fluttered with nerves she could not name. She entered the foyer to find the unexpected. Her father stood beneath the hanging lamp, his coat still damp from travel, his face drawn tight with worry, or perhaps frustration. His breathing was strained, and he pressed a hand to his chest before straightening at the sight of her. "Father," she said, startled. "You're back." "This couldn't wait," Charles replied, his voice clipped. "We need to discuss your future." Her stomach tightened. "What happened?" "A letter," he said, pulling a folded parchment from his coat. "From England." She took it, her hands trembling. The paper felt heavy. She recognized the seal. "It is from Lord Everett Dunmore," Charles explained. "He has expressed interest in courting you." Mia's breath left her entirely. Courting her. Her mind reeled. "Why?" "Why?" Charles scoffed. "Because he is titled, respectable, and in need of a proper alliance, and because you are of age to marry, Mia. And my opinion," she whispered. "Your opinion will not secure this family's standing," he snapped, then winced as another cough tore through him. He steadied himself on the hall table, breaths labored. Mia stepped forward, fear rising. "Father," "You're unwell." "It's nothing," he said sharply. "What matters is this. Dunmore is an opportunity we cannot ignore. Our name is not as unshakable as it once was." The admission was like a cold wind through her bones. She saw the truth in his pallor, the tremor in his fingers, the exhaustion etched in his eyes. "No," she whispered, "I cannot consider him." "Mia," he pressed, voice taut with urgency, "we have no luxury for refusal." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with newfound strength. "I will not marry a stranger to repair what was never my fault." Charles's jaw tightened, but beneath it she glimpsed fear, not of her rejection, but of his unraveling world. He turned away, defeated by breath more than argument, and Mia, trembling yet resolute, stood alone in the doorway, the embers of her old life dying, and the first glow of something unnamed flickering within her. Outside, the orchard rustled softly, as if urging her forward into a life she had never dared imagine. The storm came at dawn. Heavy clouds rolled over the Hudson Valley, with the slow inevitability of something ancient and angry. Rain hammered the slate roof of the Fairchild estate and streaked the tall windows with grey. Thunder echoed low in the distance, not sharp or violent, just steady like a drumbeat signaling something already unraveling. Inside, the halls were dim, despite the hour. The fireplace in the drawing room hissed with damp logs, and the scent of smoke mixed with the faint perfume of old lavender and damp wool. Mia sat at the breakfast table in her pale blue morning dress, her tea untouched, her eyes locked on the newspaper opened before her. The print was smudged, wet in places, but the words remained legible enough. A column buried deep in the Society and Scandal page, barely 6 paragraphs long. But it was enough. "She is not only plain, but proud," the writer had scrawled in ink and venom. "A woman so unfortunate in appearance that even her family's fortune cannot distract from the awkward tragedy of her presence. At a recent winter ball, she was publicly identified, accurately, as the magnate's unfortunate daughter. The label has since gained such notoriety among Fifth Avenue salons that it now circulates in jest as if it were her given name. No signature, no remorse. Only that icy tone of detachment used by those who destroy for amusement." Mia's fingers curled into the linen tablecloth. Her chest ached, not from surprise, for the cruelty was not new, but from the permanence of it. The phrase had followed her here. It had crossed rivers and ridgelines, slipped past trees, and now stood beside her like an unwelcome guest. She did not cry. The tears had dried long ago, like petals pressed between pages. She folded the paper slowly, setting it down with deliberate care. Then she stood and walked out into the rain. The orchard was slick and silver, the grass flattened under the weight of water, the trees dripping with it. She didn't wear a cloak. The cold sank into her skin, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was still real. Daniel was beneath the central apple tree, repairing a sagging trellis with soaked sleeves and shoulders dusted with rain. When he heard her footsteps squelching through the mud, he straightened, startled. "Mia!" he said, eyes narrowing at the sight of her damp hair, the pale silk clinging to her wrists. "You'll catch your death." "Let me!" she snapped. He stepped forward, confused, concerned. "What happened?" She stopped a few feet away, trembling. "You don't read the papers, do you?" His brow furrowed. "Not often." "Why?" She laughed, short and hollow. "Then perhaps you don't know. I'm famous, Mr. Walsh. Quite the joke in Manhattan, a walking punchline, a cautionary tale wrapped in a dowry." His face changed, not with shock, but with a slow, simmering anger. "What are you talking about?" "They called me a tragedy," she whispered, in print, with ink, for everyone to pass around at tea. Daniel stepped forward again, gently this time, his voice lower. "You are not what they say. Don't." She raised a hand. "Please don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm breakable. Like I'm someone you pity." Daniel's expression darkened, his voice tight. "Is that what you think this is?" "I don't know," she said too quickly. "What else could it be? You work, I watch. You help, I flinch. You speak gently. I pretend not to hear what you're really thinking. His jaw tensed. You think I don't see you? That I don't know what it cost you to walk through these fields after being thrown to wolves? I think you're kind, she said, her voice cracking. But kindness is a coat you put on when the weather demands it. When the sun comes out, it gets folded away. Thunder rumbled behind them. Daniel looked at her for a long, trembling second. Then he turned his head slightly, and there, just beyond the trees, stood Thomas. The boy was barefoot, holding his wooden horse, eyes wide and brimming with fear. Mia's chest constricted. She stepped toward him slowly. "Thomas," she murmured, "it's all right." He didn't speak. He simply ran to her, wrapping his thin arms around her waist, burying his face against her side. She held him close, cradling the back of his head. The warmth of his small body pressed against her calmed the panic inside her chest. She looked up and met Daniel's gaze. It was unguarded now, wounded, yes, but also filled with something tender, something aching. "I didn't mean it," she whispered. "Not like that." "I know," he said quietly. But words said in pain still leave marks. And they stood there in the rain, unmoving, with Thomas clinging to both of them, a fragile thread holding 3 broken hearts together. That evening, the house was quiet. The storm had passed, but the clouds remained low, smearing the sky in greys and mauves. Mia sat in the library alone, the candle beside her flickering. She opened the carved wooden chest where her mother's books were kept, and there, wrapped in faded cloth, was a small volume of short stories. She hadn't touched it in years. The pages smelled of dried roses and thyme. She found the story her mother always read on nights she couldn't sleep, the tale of a girl whose voice had been stolen by wind, only to find it again through a single, whispered song. She rose, the book in hand, and found Thomas curled up on the window seat, knees to chest, watching the raindrops trickle down the pane. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. He nodded without turning. She sat beside him, opened the book, and began. Her voice was soft at first, almost uncertain, but the rhythm returned quickly. The words, though simple, carried warmth. Thomas relaxed slowly, his breath evening out. His head dropped gently onto her shoulder. Mia kept reading. For him, yes, but also for herself. With each word, her heart found steadiness again, not unlike the way her mother once steadied her with stories in this very room. When she closed the book, Thomas had drifted to sleep. She pressed a kiss to his curls, then tucked a blanket over him before rising to stir the fire. As she did, she noticed another paper had arrived, this one folded on the mantel. Someone had delivered it quietly. She opened it cautiously, expecting more poison. But this time, it was a different note entirely. In last month's issue, a remark concerning Miss Mia Fairchild was quoted out of context. The gentleman involved, Mr. Lionel Beechcroft, has since expressed regret, assuring us he meant no harm. We extend our apologies for the discomfort caused to the Fairchild family. Below it, a quote, "A misstep in humor should not be mistaken for cruelty." Beechcroft's name printed in full. Mia read it twice. She folded the paper with care, then walked to the hearth, fed it to the flames and watched as it curled, blackened and disappeared. She made no comment, no triumph, no bitterness, only silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the leaves still dripped, and deep in the orchard the roots held firm beneath the damp earth, soaking in what they needed, discarding what they did not. Mia Fairchild stood by the fire, the boy asleep behind her, and the warmth of words clinging gently to her ribs. She was not healed, but she was no longer broken. She was, quietly and without fanfare, becoming something whole. The day Charles Fairchild returned to the Hudson Valley, the sky hung low and swollen, as if holding its breath. Heavy clouds gathered above the hills, threatening rain they had not yet released. The air was thick, humid, expectant. Even the orchard felt tense, its budding branches rustling with a warning of the storm to come. Mia sensed the unease long before the carriage wheels cracked across the gravel. She stood near the parlor window. the lace curtains brushing her wrist, and watched as the familiar crest on the carriage door flickered into view. Her father descended with stiff, careful movements, his spine straight, but his steps betraying strain. When he waved off the footman's attempt to help him, she recognized the gesture, a man clinging to dignity while his strength slipped through his fingers. Charles entered the house with the stale smell of train smoke clinging to his coat. He removed his gloves slowly, as though the effort cost more than it should. When he lifted his handkerchief to his lips, the sound that followed was not merely a cough. It was the kind that shuddered through his chest, deep and raw. "Father," Mia said, hurrying toward him. He straightened sharply. "I'm fine." The words were clipped, hollow. "We need to speak." She hesitated, her hands folded before her. "Of course." He walked to the drawing room, each step measured. Mia followed, heart pounding. The storm outside crept closer, shadows gathering on the grass. Once inside, Charles closed the door behind them. He did not sit. He stood by the mantel, his fingers tracing the carved wood. "I received a letter," he began. Mia's stomach tightened. "From whom?" "Lord Everett Dunmore." The name fell like a stone between them. Charles withdrew a folded sheet from his coat pocket and offered it to her. She took it reluctantly. The fine parchment smelled of lavender and foreign halls. "He formally expresses his intention to court you," Charles said, his voice toneless. "He wishes to visit here in 2 weeks' time." Mia stared at the letter without unfolding it, her throat constricted. "I do not want this," she whispered. Charles inhaled sharply, then coughed again, this time harsher, bending slightly as he pressed the handkerchief to his lips. When he lowered it, there was a faint pink stain, so light she questioned whether she had imagined it, but his eyes told her she had not. "Father," she murmured, stepping forward. "Please." He raised a hand to stop her. "This is not about my health. It is about your future." "My future," she echoed softly. "Or your legacy." Charles's jaw tensed. "Do you think I enjoy this? Pressuring my daughter to accept an advantageous match?" He exhaled shakily. "But our name is not as invincible as it once was." He moved toward the window, bracing one hand on the sill. The orchard stretched beyond them, peaceful and indifferent. Mia could see the faint tremble in his fingers. "Investments have faltered," he continued. "Partners grow skittish. A connection to British nobility could—" "Save you," she finished. "Save us," he corrected sharply. "It could protect you, protect everything I built for you." Mia felt heat rising in her cheeks, not anger at first, but grief. "I do not wish to marry a stranger." "You cannot afford to be choosy," he snapped. The words struck her like an open palm. Her breath hitched. She staggered a step back, nearly reaching for the wall behind her. The room tilted. For a moment she could not hear the approaching rumble of thunder, only the echo of his voice, sharp as broken glass. "You are not beautiful enough to be choosy." Mia's hands trembled violently at her sides. Charles froze, as if realizing the cruelty of what he'd said, but he did not take it back. Pride held him silent. Pride and fear. Mia lifted her chin, though her vision blurred. "I see," she whispered. She did not wait for permission. She turned, opened the door, and stepped into the corridor with the unsteady dignity of a woman who has been cut, but refuses to bleed where others can see. As she crossed the foyer, thunder cracked overhead. The first drops of rain tapped against the windows. Mia walked straight outside, down the back steps, and into the orchard without cloak or bonnet. The sky darkened deeper with each step. Her dress clung to her legs as the wind pushed against her. She walked blindly between the rows of trees, her breath sharp, her chest burning. By the time she reached the heart of the orchard, the full force of the storm had arrived. Rain poured in sheets, drenching her hair, turning the earth beneath her into slick mud. She didn't care. She paced in tight circles, her hands pressed to her temples. She could still hear her father's voice. Every word, every unkind truth he had hurled like a stone. Footsteps approached. "Mia!" Daniel's voice carried through the storm, deep and urgent. She didn't turn. She couldn't. He reached her within moments, breath unsteady, water running down his face and dripping from his hair. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice harsh with concern. "You'll catch—" "Leave me," she whispered, though her voice cracked on the last word. "Not until you tell me what happened." She spun toward him, rain streaking her cheeks, her hair plastered to her face. Nothing happened. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and saw everything she tried to hide. The shaking, the grief, the humiliation carved too deeply for words. "Mia," he said softly, "your father hurt you." A sob choked in her throat. "It doesn't matter." "It does." "No," she said, her shoulders trembling. "It shouldn't." Daniel stepped closer, but not enough to touch her. His restraint was a palpable thing between them. "Tell me," he said gently. "I can't," she whispered. "If I say it aloud, it might stay." The rain thundered around them. Lightning cracked, illuminating her face, the anguish, the vulnerability, the desperate need to remain upright. Daniel inhaled deeply. "I lost my wife," he said suddenly. Mia froze. He continued, voice low, raw, the storm reflecting in his eyes. "She died in the winter, fever. 1 week we thought she would recover. The next, she was gone." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't enough to save her." Her breath caught. "I haven't let myself feel anything since," he said. "Not really, not with anyone." His eyes glistened with rain and something more. "But when I see you, I remember what it felt like to hope, and that scares me." "Akaki!" The orchard seemed to inhale. Mia's lips trembled. The storm roared, but the world narrowed to the space between them. She stepped closer, not fully, but enough that her hand brushed his. The moment the contact came, the tension between them shuddered. Her fingers hovered over his knuckles for a beat before settling lightly atop them. Her touch was tentative, trembling, but deliberate. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as though her touch steadied something inside him. "Mia," he whispered, and her name on his lips felt like something sacred. Thunder rumbled again, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Rain pelted the branches overhead, dripping onto their shoulders in uneven rhythms. "Inside," Daniel murmured, urging her gently toward the old barn on the edge of the orchard. "Before the lightning gets worse." She followed him, her hand still grazing his, her heart pounding with a force she did not understand. The barn welcomed them with the scent of hay and damp wood. The storm rattled the roof, wind howling through small cracks between the planks. Daniel closed the door behind them, leaving only the dim lantern glow and the pounding rain outside. They stood a few feet apart, soaked, breathless, trembling. Mia wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, not from cold but from the weight of all she carried. Daniel stepped forward. He did not touch her, not yet. He only lifted one hand and brushed a single strand of wet hair away from her face. The gesture was so gentle, so reverent that her knees went weak. "Mia," he whispered again, his voice fraying, "you deserved better than whatever he said to you." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell, only rain. "He said I wasn't beautiful." Daniel's breath hitched. "He's blind." She shook her head. "He said I'm not beautiful enough to be choosy." Daniel closed the distance between them, not pressing, not demanding, but offering. She stepped closer, until their foreheads touched, breath mingling, each exhale carrying the weight of truths long buried. They stood like that for a long moment. No kiss, no embrace, just two wounded hearts finding a fragile shelter in the storm. Her breath trembled. His did too. And in the quiet space between lightning strikes, Mia finally exhaled the pain she had held for years. Daniel inhaled it, held it with her, and let their silence become a promise. Unspoken, yet unmistakable. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something new took root. The orchard bloomed as if it had waited all year for this very moment. In the still mornings the trees whispered with petals, pale pink and ivory, trembling in the breeze like lace in a trembling hand. The air held a sweetness that clung to the skin and clothing, that slipped into the folds of linen and the strands of unbound hair. Mia walked the orchard path barefoot. The grass was warm beneath her soles, still damp with dew, and the sunlight filtered through the flowering branches like an old memory. She carried a basket with a folded cloth, 2 slices of honey cake, and a book of verses. She had begun leaving small poems tucked inside Daniel's tool shed, never signed, but always found. He said nothing of them, but she knew he read them, for each one disappeared quietly by morning. They had fallen into a rhythm, gentle and unspoken. In the hours between sunrise and dusk, Daniel worked while Mia brought tea and stories, helped Thomas with his letters, and repaired the curtains in the cottage near the west field that had been unused for years. She hummed sometimes. He smiled more often. They shared supper beneath the trees twice a week, once alone, once with Thomas curled against Mia's side, blinking sleepily into her shoulder as she read him fairy tales. One evening, near the edge of twilight, Mia lit lanterns along the orchard path, their soft, golden light swaying between the branches. She wore a faded cream dress, the hem stained faintly with soil. Her hair was pinned up loosely, tendrils falling about her neck. Daniel arrived with a repaired basket in hand and a quiet apology for the delay. "Dance with me," she said suddenly, her eyes wide and unsure, the way a girl might speak in a dream. He stared at her for a long moment, and then, perhaps because the moon had just risen or because her voice trembled, he set the basket down and stepped forward. "I don't dance well," he murmured. "Neither do I." They danced barefoot on damp earth, the orchard floor their ballroom. There was no music but the breeze and the occasional chirp of nightbirds. They moved slowly, clumsily, laughing under their breath each time he stepped on the edge of her dress. When she stumbled, he caught her with calloused hands, his touch as reverent as prayer. The scent of blossoms swirled around them, thick and heady, and for one breathless moment, their bodies drew too close. Her forehead brushed his. She felt the warmth of his breath, the tremor in his exhale, the restraint in his stillness, and then he stepped back, slowly, his fingers releasing hers, as if from a promise he dared not make. "Good night, Miss Fairchild," he said, voice husky. She watched him walk away, her hands still tingling, her chest aching with the sweetness of something too fragile to name. The next morning brought a different kind of bloom. A coach arrived just after noon, black, glossy, pulled by 2 pristine greys. The footman who stepped down first bore the unmistakable poise of old money, and behind him descended Lord Everett Dunmore, looking precisely as Mia remembered from the sketches and reputation. Tall, elegant, with eyes like polished ice and a mouth that never truly smiled. His presence felt like a sudden frost on a summer day. Charles had summoned him without Mia's knowledge. She saw the glint of triumph in her father's eyes as he welcomed the visitor, and the dread that bloomed in her stomach was colder than fear. She wore no corset, no jewels, only a modest cotton day dress and a braid she hadn't thought to tuck. She made no apologies. Lord Dunmore bowed, his movements smooth and calculated. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his accent crisp, "your name precedes you, and yet, I must say, you are not what I expected." "I rarely am," she replied, her voice even. They sat in the drawing-room, Charles beaming between them. Tea was poured, pleasantries exchanged. Dunmore spoke of declining estates, rising tariffs, and the value of transatlantic alliances. He spoke of partnership the way merchants speak of shipping routes, dry, precise, entirely bloodless. "I have no illusions of romantic attachment," he said plainly, "but I have found in such unions that mutual benefit can be more enduring than sentiment." Mia said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and nodded slowly, once. From the hallway, Daniel heard it all. He had come to deliver a repaired garden tool to the steward, but stopped at the sound of voices. His hand clenched around the handle. He listened. heart tightening with every word that passed unchallenged. He heard the silence that followed Dunmore's proposition, heard the pause, heard Mia say nothing, and in that stillness, he misread her silence. He did not see the fury growing behind her quiet. He only saw the poised woman entertaining the suitor who offered her name in exchange for a cage. That night, Daniel packed a small bag. He wrote a short note of resignation and left it with the steward. Then, without waking Thomas, he carried the boy into the carriage waiting at the end of the road. At sunrise, Mia woke to an empty orchard. The cottage was cold, the tool shed silent. The laughter of the past week erased, as though it had never happened. She found the note. One line. "Forgive me. I could not stay where I did not belong." She stared at the words for what felt like hours, the parchment trembling in her hand. By late morning, Charles stood in the parlor, flushed with agitation. "This is for the best," he declared. "Now you will marry Dunmore, and this foolishness will be behind us." Mia looked at him. Something within her already decided. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Charles straightened. "Excuse me? You may take your name," she said, her voice rising like the wind, "but you will not take my future." He stared at her, stunned. "I have lived too long in the echo of your ambitions," she continued, trembling but unbroken. "I have paid for them with my silence, but I will not sign my life away to a man who looks at me like a ledger entry." Charles opened his mouth to argue, but the weight in her gaze stopped him. She had never looked so much like her mother. Not in her features, but in her fire. He turned away, breath shallow, and said nothing more. Mia returned to the orchard that evening. The blossoms were still falling, like snow that knew no season. She stood beneath the tree where they had danced, the lanterns now cold and unlit. She pressed her hand to the bark, still damp with morning rain. She closed her eyes and whispered a name. Not Dunmore's, not her father's, only one name. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of longing, full of roots, full of choice. The sky split open just after midnight. For hours the storm had threatened, grumbling along the ridgelines and pacing the river, circling like a wolf. But when the first bolt struck, it came without mercy, tearing through the clouds with blinding silver, cleaving the darkness in two. Thunder followed, so violent it rattled the window panes of the Fairchild estate and made the chandeliers tremble overhead. Mia had not been sleeping. She had been pacing her room, the silence of Daniel's absence heavier now than it had been days before. She paused at the window as a second lightning strike illuminated the orchard. Then, horror, a faint orange glow. At first, she thought it an illusion, a trick of lightning, but then it grew, flickering, alive, flames rising from the west orchard like tongues of hunger, devouring blossoms and bark with cruel abandon. The west field was on fire. Mia ran. Down the corridor, past the parlor, through the kitchen. Barefoot, breathless, she didn't wait for staff. She didn't wait for sense. She burst into the rain, skirts clinging to her legs, hair unbound, heart pounding. The orchard blazed in the distance, a twisting, roaring thing. Farmhands shouted over the wind, forming a desperate chain with buckets drawn from the well. The rain fell hard, but not enough. Not yet. Mia reached the west slope just as another branch cracked under heat, crashing to the earth in a burst of sparks. The heat was oppressive, the smoke thick, but she did not hesitate. She grabbed a pail, joined the line. Mud sucked at her heels as she moved, her arms aching with every throw of water, but she did not stop. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos. "Get back!" She turned toward the sound and froze. Daniel. He was soaked, hair plastered to his face, shirt clinging to his chest, boots caked in ash and mud. His eyes met hers across the smoke and flame, wide with disbelief and something fiercer than fear. "What are you doing here?" she shouted. "I saw it from Kingston," he called back, moving toward her. "I couldn't—" But the words were lost in a crash of thunder. They did not speak again. There was no time, only motion, only survival. Together they fought. By dawn, the flames had been conquered. The rain, finally steady, had done what their hands could not. Ash coated the ground like sorrow. Half the western orchard was lost, but the fire had been contained. The house, the heart of the land, still stood. Mia stood at the edge of the burned field, hair dripping, hands blistered, dress stained beyond repair. She could barely lift her arms. Then a shout rose from the house. "Mr. Fairchild!" She turned. The steward was running toward them, breathless. He collapsed by the fireplace. "We can't wake him." Mia dropped her pail and ran. Her legs trembled, her vision swam, but she did not stop. She found her father slumped in his armchair, his face waxy, his chest rising in shallow fits. Blood stained his handkerchief, brighter than the fire. "Call the doctor," she ordered, falling to her knees. "Now!" He moaned faintly as she pressed a cool cloth to his brow. She did not cry. She held his hand. He had been terrible to her, unkind, merciless, but he was her father. And now he was dying. The doctor came. He spoke in low tones, his expression grim. "Stress, lungs, the heart. He's weak, Miss Fairchild. You must prepare for what may come." Mia did not leave his side for 2 days. She fed him broth spoon by spoon, changed his linens, read to him in the quiet hours. She slept in the chair beside his bed, her back aching, her throat raw. It was during those sleepless nights that the final blow fell. A telegram arrived. "Fairchild interests have collapsed. The board has dissolved. Bank demands repayment." 2 sentences. Enough to undo a dynasty. Mia sat alone in her father's study after reading it. The fire crackled. The oil lamp flickered. On the desk lay her mother's journal, worn and yellowed. She opened it without thinking, seeking comfort in the familiar handwriting. Inside, a folded scrap of paper slipped out. A letter her mother had once written to her father, signed in ink that had faded to a soft brown. It read simply, "I chose you not for your empire, but because you made me feel less alone in the world. When that is gone, I hope you still remember who you were when I loved you." Mia closed her eyes. She could not fix the empire. She could not change the past, but she could choose how to carry the weight of it. That night, as the rain whispered on the roof and her father drifted into fitful sleep, Mia sat at the writing desk and lit a candle. She drew out fresh parchment. She dipped her pen in ink, and she began, "Dear Daniel, I am not writing to ask you to return. I am not writing to undo what was said or left unsaid. I only wish to thank you for showing me what love looks like when it is quiet, when it is steady, when it asks nothing and gives everything. You reminded me that kindness is not weakness, that silence can be shelter, that a heart once broken can bloom again. Wherever you go, may the trees bend gently to you. May your son never forget how it feels to be safe, and may you know always that you left something blooming in me. With all that I am, Mia." She folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and gave it to Walter, the old coachman, with one instruction. "Deliver this to Mr. Walsh in Kingston. No urgency, just certainty." For 3 days, she waited. She did not pace. She did not hope. She moved through the rooms of the estate with quiet purpose. She replanted what she could. She visited her father's bedside, now quiet with breath and apology. She continued Thomas's lessons in the empty library, even if he wasn't there. And then, on the 4th evening, as the sky blushed gold with the last light of day, a knock echoed from the edge of the orchard gate. Mia stood in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, her apron streaked with work. She froze. The knock came again, firm, familiar. She walked slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt. Each step was measured, as though her soul had already begun to weep, too afraid to believe. She crossed the threshold, the light spilling onto the orchard path, and there, framed by twilight and wood and wind, stood Daniel. His shirt was open at the collar. His boots were dusted from the road. In one arm he held a folded coat. In the other, Thomas. The boy clutched a small bouquet of crushed orchard flowers. Daniel said nothing at first. Neither did Mia. She simply looked at him, and he at her. Then slowly he stepped forward and offered her the boy's hand. "I read your letter," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. "I came back," he added, voice low, "not because you asked, but because you didn't." And in that silence, in that trembling stillness between dusk and night, between grief and grace, Mia stepped forward, and everything she had waited for unfolded not in a kiss, not in a declaration, but in a single, tearful breath. Home. At last, the knock still echoed faintly through the orchard path when Mia opened the door. The air was still damp from the storm, rich with the scent of scorched earth and apple leaves. A mist clung to the ground, as if the valley itself held its breath. And there he stood, Daniel Walsh, at the edge of her world once more. His boots were thick with mud, his shirt wrinkled from the road. Rain-dark curls clung to his brow. One arm clutched a folded coat, the other cradled a sleeping child. Thomas, cheeks flushed from the ride, lashes resting peacefully against his skin. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mia stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered near the frame of the door. The light from the hall lamp spilled onto the porch, casting Daniel's features into warm relief. The ridges of worry still carved into his brow, the silence that always held more weight than his words. "I wasn't sure you'd—" she began, voice hushed. "I wasn't either," he replied. His voice was hoarse, low. "But your letter—" He paused, eyes flicking down to Thomas. "It reminded me that some things don't have to be finished to be worth returning to." Thomas shifted slightly, letting out a soft sigh. Mia stepped closer, instinct guiding her, and gently adjusted the boy's collar with a mother's tenderness. Daniel watched her hand. He kept asking why we left. "I told him we had to help my brother, that the trees here were tired." His gaze lifted to hers. "But the truth is, I was the one who ran, not him." Mia blinked, her heart tightening. "I have no fortune, no name," Daniel said finally, shoulders straightening despite the weariness. Mia didn't flinch. "Then you'll understand what we're building." A hush fell. In it lived every question unspoken, every answer neither dared demand. The orchard loomed behind them in the night, a ghost of what it once was, yet still standing. She stepped back and opened the door fully. "Come in," she said softly, "not as a servant, not as a guest, as part of this home, if you still want it." Daniel stood motionless. The weight of the moment stretched between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. Then, with a single nod, he crossed the threshold. The fire was low in the hearth, casting golden waves across the wood floors. Mia took Thomas gently from Daniel's arms, settling the boy onto the nearby settee. He didn't stir. She pulled a crocheted blanket over his small form and lingered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. When she turned, Daniel was standing near the fire, his hands open at his sides, not reaching, not presuming, simply waiting. Mia crossed to him. "I thought I was done with hope," she whispered. "Then you came back." Daniel's hand lifted, hesitant, calloused fingers brushing the edge of her jaw. "I'm not here to fix your life. I'm here because, without you, mine doesn't feel like it leads anywhere." Their foreheads met, not in hunger, but in surrender. Eyes closed, breath mingling. Her hand found his chest, his heart thundered beneath it, wild and alive. The kiss came not as a spark, but as a hush, soft, reverent, almost afraid to exist. It was not the kiss of novels or moonlight fantasies. It was the kiss of two people who had lived through silence and chosen to speak, who had lost and dared finally to claim something for themselves. When they broke apart, neither moved. Then from the settee, a small voice rose, groggy and sweet. "Mama?" Mia turned, her breath catching. Thomas sat up slowly, blinking through sleep, his small face framed by unruly curls. His eyes found Mia's, and though they were heavy with dreams, there was no doubt in the word he had spoken. Daniel inhaled sharply. "Thomas, But the boy only blinked again, then reached toward Mia with both arms. She knelt beside him, arms trembling as she gathered him in. He clung to her neck, and for a long moment she could not breathe. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here." When she lifted her gaze, Daniel had knelt beside them, one arm curled protectively around them both. There were no declarations, no promises. Just a moment in time, one heartbeat long, where all three existed not as broken pieces, but as something whole. That night, Daniel stayed in the guest room once used by visiting bankers and distant cousins. The linens were simple, the window cracked open to let in the summer wind. Mia tucked Thomas into her bed and lay beside him, the child's tiny hand resting on her arm. She watched the ceiling until sleep claimed her, her heart no longer aching with absence. The next morning, the orchard smelled of soot and earth, but the sun shone through mist like a benediction. Breakfast was quiet. Thomas, still half drowsy, ate warm oats with honey. Daniel mended a broken kitchen chair without being asked. Mia watched him through the window as he stepped into the field and turned over a patch of soil with the ease of long memory. Later, they sat beneath the pergola near the east orchard. Mia brought out a pitcher of lemonade and a single book, her mother's favorite volume of poems. She read aloud while Daniel listened, and Thomas napped again with his head in her lap. A breeze stirred the branches. "I think," Daniel said after a long pause, "we could plant new saplings where the fire was." Mia closed the book. "We'll need strong roots." He nodded. "We will." Silence followed. Not empty, but full. That evening, as twilight gathered like smoke above the hills, Mia wrote a short note to the estate steward. "Please, have the south rooms cleaned. Mr. Walsh and his son will be staying. Indefinitely." She sealed it with wax. She no longer needed society's approval, no longer needed to be seen to feel real. Her life would be measured not in debutante dances or columns of scandal, but in evening meals, shared labor, quiet joy. Later, after Thomas had gone to bed, Mia stood at the orchard's edge. Daniel joined her, his hand warm around hers. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "we'll dig." He leaned his forehead to hers again. "Together." She smiled. It wasn't radiant or perfect, but it was real. A home was not built with blueprints or marble. It began with choosing again and again the people who returned, and in that she had already won. A place for three, at last. The morning light filtered through branches thick with blossom, casting golden dapples across the orchard path. Dew clung to petals, trembling like the memory of tears not shed. Birds flitted between boughs, heavy with promise, and the air carried the perfume of new beginnings. 1 year had passed, and everything had changed, yet nothing had been rushed. Mia stood beneath the arching limbs of an apple tree, her apron dusted with flour and pollen, a small ink stain smudged near her wrist. A book lay open on a wooden bench nearby, pages fluttering with the breeze. Laughter rang through the trees, light, unself-conscious, the laughter of children. She looked up from the crate she had been organizing and smiled. Dozens of little voices were scattered among the orchard rows, seated cross-legged beneath the trees, their eager faces turned toward the makeshift chalkboard propped up against a wheelbarrow. Today's lesson was about the constellations. She had brought a storybook, illustrated with stars and myths, and the children had listened with wide eyes and restless hearts. Mia's school was not grand. It had no marble columns or gas chandeliers, but it had open skies, the shade of trees, and a teacher who believed that stories could heal what silence had once bruised. A soft whistle reached her ears. She turned to see Daniel approaching from the edge of the property, a crate of early apples balanced on one shoulder. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, collar undone, curls slightly tousled from the spring wind. His gait was relaxed, but there was purpose in every step. He set the crate down beside her and reached for her hand with unspoken familiarity. "How many little minds did you stir this morning?" he asked with a lopsided smile. "More than yesterday," she replied. The twins from the mill were late. but Thomas saved them a spot. At the sound of his name, their son, her son now in every way that mattered, came bounding toward them, arms full of red ribbons. "Ma! We ran out of twine, so I'm using these instead." His cheeks were flushed, curls bouncing, a smear of dirt on his chin. Mia crouched down, brushing the soil from his face with the edge of her sleeve. "Very resourceful, Mr. Walsh." He grinned, puffing his chest. "I'm the ribbon boss." Daniel laughed and hoisted him into the air briefly before settling him back onto his feet. "Then get to it, ribbon boss." Thomas saluted and dashed off, scattering laughter and petals in his wake. They stood in silence for a moment, watching him disappear into the trees. Daniel turned to Mia, his voice lower now. "I heard from Ezra this morning. The last of the shipments made it to Albany. We'll break even." She exhaled, nodding. "Enough for another season." "More than enough," he murmured. "We'll never be rich, but we're rooted." She looked at him then, really looked. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes. The sun had deepened the tan on his skin, and his hands bore fresh calluses. But there was peace there, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning. From the porch of the house, a faint cough echoed. Charles Fairchild sat in his high-backed wooden chair, a blanket over his knees despite the warming sun. His once powerful figure had softened, diminished by time and illness, but his eyes remained sharp beneath the silver fringe of his brow. He held a cup of tea he never drank and watched the scene before him as though it were a painting too precious to touch. He didn't speak much these days, but when Thomas ran to him, breathless with some small victory, a bug in a jar, a story well read, he listened. And when Mia kissed his temple in passing, he closed his eyes and smiled, as if storing the moment somewhere quiet inside him. Later that afternoon, when the last child had gone home with books underarm and crumbs in pocket, Daniel brought out a young sapling wrapped in burlap and tied with string. "Shall we?" he asked. Mia nodded, brushing loose curls from her forehead. They walked together to the far edge of the orchard, where the fire had once licked the sky and turned trees into ash. The ground had healed slowly. The workers had cleared the charred remains, and Mia had planted wildflowers there that bloomed defiantly between stones. Now, with care, they dug. Thomas knelt beside them, hands small and eager, crumbling earth between his fingers. Mia held the sapling upright, while Daniel steadied the base. Together, they pressed dirt into place. "Go on," Daniel said gently, handing Thomas the last handful. The boy looked between them, then scooped the soil and dropped it around the roots. "There," he whispered. "Now it'll stay." Mia looked at Daniel, her throat tight. "It's not much. It's everything," he replied. Evening fell slowly. Shadows stretched long over the rows of trees, and a hush settled over the land. From the porch, Charles watched them return, leaning slightly on each other, framed by the darkening sky. He raised his teacup in a silent salute, then lowered it with reverence. That night, the house was filled with the scent of fresh bread and apple compote. Thomas fell asleep on a pile of cushions with a book open on his chest. Mia covered him with a quilt, then found Daniel in the parlor, tuning the strings of a battered violin he had found in the attic weeks before. He played softly, just a few notes, a lullaby remembered. She stood behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. Neither spoke. When the music stopped, he tilted his head back to look at her. "This, whatever we have, I never imagined I'd be part of something like this." "You didn't have to imagine it," she said. "You just had to come back." His hand found hers. He brought it to his lips and kissed the knuckles with quiet reverence. They stayed like that, the fire crackling low, the house still. Outside, the orchard bloomed. The trees no longer bore the weight of legacy or pride. They bore fruit and shelter. They bore laughter and stories and scars. And they bore witness to a love that did not dazzle the world, but grew slowly, honestly, and without apology. Mia Fairchild was no longer the subject of gossip, nor the daughter of a magnate. She was a teacher, a mother, a partner, a woman who had been broken and chose to build. The Fairchild name no longer shimmered in the society pages, but in the Hudson Valley it was spoken with quiet respect of the woman who stayed and the man who returned. And as another spring unfolded, the orchard bloomed again. So did she. The orchard stretched in every direction, heavy with blossoms as pale as first snow. The trees had grown fuller over the years, their branches tangled like hands that had learned to hold and never let go. The breeze moved through them gently, whispering through leaves that remembered everything. Mia stood near the edge of the orchard, her apron dusted with flour, her boots wet with morning dew. A breeze caught the loose strands of her dark hair, now streaked with silver at the temples. In one hand, she held a weathered book of poems. In the other, a small bouquet of wildflowers picked by tiny, eager hands. She turned at the sound of laughter, a child's giggle, shrill and delighted. Thomas ran across the field with his sister chasing after him, her golden braids bouncing beneath her bonnet. Lila, barely 4, with Mia's steady eyes and Daniel's fierce smile, stomped her tiny boots in determination. "Thomas, give it back!" he whooped with glee, holding her stuffed rabbit high above his head. "Not unless you say I'm the king of the orchard." "You're not! Mama is!" Daniel walked behind them, slower now, a quiet grin tugging at his mouth. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands stained with dirt and sap. His hair had gone a shade lighter at the edges, but his posture, strong, certain, had not changed. He caught Lila as she ran past and spun her once in the air, her laughter rising like birdsong. "Give it back, son," he said, gently stern. Thomas handed over the rabbit, with theatrical reluctance. "Only because you said so, Papa." From the porch, Charles watched them. His hair had thinned to wisps of silver. He rarely spoke these days, and often sat for hours without moving, his gaze fixed on the trees. But when Thomas passed by, he would lift his hand in greeting, and when Lila kissed his cheek, he smiled faintly, as if remembering something only he could still see. Mia joined him on the porch, setting the bouquet in a glass jar beside his chair. "Your orchard," she whispered. His eyes remained on the trees. Slowly, his hand reached out and squeezed hers. They had buried pride and planted something gentler in its place. Inside the house, the walls had been repainted in soft hues. The study was now a classroom filled with books and small desks. The school had grown over the years, children from neighboring farms, from the mill town downriver, even from the village schoolhouse now sent letters asking to learn beneath the trees. Mia taught them not only reading and arithmetic, but how to question, how to feel, how to wonder. She taught them to plant things they might never live to harvest. At the back of the orchard stood the sapling they had planted that first spring, a tall young tree now, branches proud and blooming. It bore fruit for the first time last year, small and tart, but full of promise. Thomas had named it Hope. Lila called it Rosie. Neither name was wrong. Daniel carved wooden toys in the evenings, sometimes mending tools, sometimes mending hearts. He had never asked Mia to marry him again. One afternoon years ago, he simply placed a ring carved from applewood on her finger and whispered, "For every season." She had never taken it off. They had loved without ceremony, raised children without fear, and built a life that was quiet, but rich in everything that mattered. And yet the world had not stood still around them. Lord Dunmore, exposed in the financial scandal that followed the collapse of the Fairchild holdings, fled to Europe. Rumours spoke of debts and disgrace, of a failed engagement to a shipping heiress, and exile in some damp Italian villa. He had written once to Mia, a brittle letter filled with apologies and regrets. She never opened it. She had tossed it into the hearth before Daniel returned from the fields. Lionel Beechcroft lost his standing slowly, not in scandal, but in relevance. His name vanished from columns. His invitations ceased. The world began to whisper about different things: education for girls, labor unions, women who refused to disappear. The old rules still held in some places, but in the Hudson Valley things had shifted. Not by revolution, but by roots, deep, stubborn, invisible. One evening, on the 5th anniversary of that first fire, Mia, Daniel, Thomas, and Lila stood beneath the stars. They lit a small lantern and watched it rise into the night. "For the ones who stayed," Mia said. "For the ones who came back," Daniel added. Lila reached for her mother's hand. "And for the trees that bloomed again." They stood like that for a long time, listening to the rustle of the orchard, to the wind moving through leaves that had weathered frost and drought and storm, and still returned with blossoms. Love had not been a fairy tale. It had been harder than that. It had required forgiveness, patience, and the courage to keep choosing each other, even on quiet days, even in silence. And that, Mia thought as she leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, was the most beautiful story of all. The orchard had bloomed again, and so had she. Some stories dazzle with diamonds and tiaras. This one bloomed with silence, patience, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to wither. Mia Fairchild's journey reminds us that beauty is not something others grant us. It's something we grow, choice by choice, season by season. She was called names meant to diminish her. She was offered a future wrapped in cold convenience. But instead of shrinking, she chose love without titles, truth without spectacle, and purpose without applause. She planted herself in the soil of her own making, and she flourished. This story isn't just about a magnate's daughter and a widowed farmhand. It's about you, about every woman who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or mislabeled. It's about finding strength in rejection, clarity in solitude, and love where the world least expects it. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Tell us what you felt, what you remembered, what you're taking with you. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word orchard in the comments. It'll be our secret way of recognizing the ones who stayed until the very last bloom. If you'd like to support the wonderful team that brings these stories to life, you can leave a super thanks down below. Any amount, big or small, helps us keep telling the kinds of stories that matter. And if that's not possible right now, no worries at all. Sharing this video with a friend who loves historical romance is another beautiful way to help this orchard grow. There are more powerful stories waiting for you. Stories of women who loved bravely, changed quietly, and lived fully. You'll find them in the cards above. Just follow the petals. Thank you for spending this time with us. May your own orchard bloom in its season.